looking at the origin of the nations and how nations divided from Noah and the beginning of languages. I'll knock that off, okay. Most people, when coming to Genesis chapter 10, will quickly pass over it as boring and even non-necessary reading. This is a part of Genesis people don't read. It appears to have no personal meaning. However, if you are interested in your family history, it has great significance. It is very popular today to study your family's genealogy. People seem to be compelled to find their own origin, from the adopted child who wants to find their birth parents to those who want to know what their heritage really is. For some, it may be bragging rights to know if there is royalty and famous people in their family tree. It could make them feel good about themselves. One may brag, "Did you know that I'm related to King James?" And another might say, "That's nothing. I got my intelligence from Albert Einstein." On the other hand, what if you learned that you were related to Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin or Al Capone? Perhaps you wouldn't be too proud of that heritage and you would want to keep that a family secret. In a recent lecture that I gave when we talked about genealogies earlier in this series, I spoke about my oldest son looking into our family history on my dad's side. My great-great-grandfather was from Germany, and his name was Jonas Zindel, and he married Anna Marie Keller back in the year 1856. It is because Anna Marie was wealthier than Jonas that to inherit his wife's money, he had to take on her last name. That is how I became a Keller. Otherwise, my last name would have been Zindel. Then my son said to me, "Dad, that is the only thing of interest in your family tree. I could not find anyone important. I'm not even related to Helen Keller." So that was a letdown. However, in truth, there are people very important in my family history and yours as well. You have to go back thousands of years to discover who they are. And when you do, you will learn that all of us have a common ancestor in Noah, and in one of his sons, either Shem, Ham, or Japheth. You can say, "I descended from Noah. My family survived the great flood." And everyone living today has those bragging rights. So, as we look at the genealogy of Noah's family, we will learn something about our family history and why we have the nationality that we do. Human history goes like this genealogically. Adam to Seth. We're talking about the righteous element of the family here. But you go from Adam to Seth to Enoch to Methuselah to Lamech to Noah. Now all those people previous to Noah died, but not necessarily in the flood. Not in the flood, in fact. Once Noah had a family, all human history before him was destroyed in the great flood, and only 8 people were left to repopulate the earth. This is the second starting point in human history, and now all of us came through Noah's line and through one of his 3 sons, either Shem, Ham, or Japheth. With me now? Okay. So let's get into our text and see if we can learn something about our own heritage. This is Genesis chapter 10, verse 1. It's the dividing of the nations. Genesis 10 opens with these words. Now, this is the generation of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and sons were born to them after the flood. So Genesis 10 gives us a detailed account of genealogies as the descendants of the 3 sons of Noah. They were spread out around the world from the Tower of Babel forming many different nations and speaking many different languages. This chapter is the oldest attempt to explain the geographic distribution of the human race. Genesis 11 gives us the detailed account of the events at the Tower of Babel, which resulted in the confusion of languages that caused this worldwide dispersion. In the first Sunday in January, we're going to go in much more detail to study the Tower of Babel. And Nimrod and this one world religion and one world government will relate it much to what's happening in our world today. Anyway, that's then. This is now. In Genesis 10, the genealogies of Noah's 3 sons are given in reverse order of their birth. The genealogies begin with the 14 families of Japheth. He's the youngest. And then the 30 families of Ham. And finally, the oldest son, Shem, and his 26 family members. Now get this, because this is significant. There are 70 families listed in Genesis 10, and all 70 families entered Egypt. You see this in Genesis chapter 46, verse 27. Remember, Joseph was sold as a slave into Egypt, and eventually all of the Israelites, or Hebrews as they were known then, came into Egypt, and then they became captive there. And so we're saying all 70 families are a part of those who went to Egypt. Once the nations were divided after the flood in the Tower of Babel, God set the boundaries of the nations according to the number of the children of Israel. This would indicate initially there were 70 different nations with 70 different languages. So there was one nation under Nimrod at the Tower of Babel, and once God confused their languages, they split out. 70 nations were formed, and 70 different languages occurred. That's what I really want you to see here. Once God confused the languages of the people of the Tower of Babel, there were 70 different languages that became the foundation for 6,000 to 7,000 different languages we find in today's world. It is interesting to note that Moses gives 2 separate genealogies of Shem. In chapter 10, beginning at verse 22, and then the second one is in chapter 11, beginning at verse 10. So there are 2 separate genealogies that Moses gives. So we want to know, why does he do that? Well, here's the answer. The difference in the 2 genealogies is that in Genesis 10, the first genealogy, the emphasis seems to be on the scattering of his people after the flood. And in that genealogy, there are 2 important names in Shem's bloodline. His grandson Eber, from whom the name Hebrew originated. Remember, the Jews, when they went to Egypt and were subjected there under the Pharaohs for 400 years, they were known at that time as Hebrew people. And it was named after Eber. Eber means crossed over. And his name prophesied the time when the Hebrew people would leave Mesopotamia. That would be the area around northern Turkey and Iraq in our world today. So that was their place of origin. They would cross over the Euphrates River to many generations later occupy what we know as the land of Canaan, or modern-day Israel. Then 2 of Eber's great-grandchildren are Peleg and Coktan. They're mentioned. Peleg means the earth was divided. So Peleg's birth seems to pinpoint the time of the Babel experience, when the world was divided into different nations and languages. The brother of Peleg was Coktan, whose family of 13 sons, this is interesting now, and we'll talk a little bit about it later, whose 13 sons settled in the Arabian Peninsula. The significance is that Israel would find ancient blood ties with these tribes that would eventually be taken over by their enemies, the Arabs. Shem's genealogy stops with Joktan, and most likely was intended to show the different directions taken by his family after the flood. So now we're beginning to see not only are Israelites involved here, but there are Arabs now that are going to be involved here, and this becomes the beginning of the Arab-Israeli crisis that we have seen going on for centuries, including today, right? Now we come to chapter 11, and Moses traces the genealogy of Shem through Eber and Peleg, but notice he does not mention Joktan at all. That's in chapter 10. Now his name is not mentioned. Rather, Moses in chapter 11 goes directly to Abraham, who became the father of the Jews, and through whose bloodline the promised Messiah would come. Matthew's gospel begins with the genealogy of Jesus Christ, beginning with Abraham, then Isaac, the promised son of Abraham by his wife Sarah, then Jacob, who became known as Israel and fathered 12 sons that ultimately became the 12 tribes to occupy the land of Canaan. You see this in verse 2 of Matthew chapter 1. The second genealogy in Genesis chapter 11 is to introduce us to Abraham as being in the bloodline of Shem and ultimately the Jewish Messiah. So, in Genesis chapter 10, Moses gives a genealogy that shows simply the scattering of the people of Shem and wherever they went. And we're going to see they went a long way. Okay. But you find from them both the Jews and the Arab people. And then in chapter 11, the purpose of his genealogy is to trace the line of Shem up through Abraham and ultimately to our Messiah, Jesus Christ. Now, the most significant evil person in Noah's genealogy, who is that? Well, the family of Ham now seems to be the major problem in Noah's genealogy. There was Canaan, Noah's grandson, and Ham's fourth son and youngest. Canaan was the one who Noah cursed after Noah was discovered by Ham to be drunk and naked. That was our lesson last week, remember? Okay. We speculated that Canaan was cursed because he was the first to see Noah in that condition and had sexual contact with him. That's one of the conclusions we came up with as to why Canaan was cursed. He was the first to see Noah in a naked condition and might have had sexual contact with him. It is also possible that Noah cursed Canaan because he had a word from God that the generations of Canaan, known as the Canaanites, would have a horrifically bad influence on the Israelites as they would be led, as they would lead them astray from God and into idolatry. We talked about all the sins of the Canaanites and when the Israelites were in the land with them, how the Israelites became more like the Canaanites. In fact, we'll note that. The Canaanites occupied the promised land prior to Israel. The Israelites were commanded to drive them out of the land. And though they took over the land, they were still Canaanites among them, whose godless ways had a greater influence for evil on Israel than Israel's God had on the Canaanites for the sake of righteousness. God wanted the Canaanites driven out because God knows that evil is stronger than good. I'm just adding this to your notes because the Canaanites influenced the Israelites more than the Israelites influenced the Canaanites. That's the point there. But the most evil and influential person in Noah's genealogy also came from the family of Ham. His name was Nimrod, the great-grandson of Noah, son of Cush, and son of Ham. We first learn about Nimrod in Genesis chapter 10, beginning of verse 8. Now here's what we read, according to Scripture. Cush, that's the son of Ham, begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord Yahweh. Therefore, it is like it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Iraq, Assad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Shinar would include modern-day Iraq. And from that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin, between Nineveh and Keller. That is the principal city. Well, that's the text there from Genesis chapter 10, beginning of verse 8. But here's what I want us to get from that. There were two cities built by Nimrod that are very significant in biblical history. Babel, which became the center for God's confounding the nations and scattering the people worldwide. The city was rebuilt under King Nebuchadnezzar and formed what was known as the Babylonian Empire, which conquered Judah and Jerusalem and took the Jews into Babylonian captivity. The other is the city of Nineveh, which became the greatest of the capitals of the ancient Assyrian Empire. This was the city to which Jonah was called to be the reluctant prophet and to convert these enemies of Israel to the Lord. Now, Nimrod was not only a builder of cities, he must have been a good contractor, but he was a mighty hunter and became a mighty one on the earth. Nimrod was the first to head up a small one-world government and one-world religion in the land of Shinar. Keep in mind, we're talking about Iraq here. It was about 100 years after the flood that the whole population of the earth, maybe 150 to 200,000 people, was together in Shinar. So all the people of the world at that time, through the population of the earth by the three sons of Noah, were all gathered in this one place called Shinar, modern-day Iraq. The people all spoke one language. Nimrod was a sun worshiper and wanted to build a tower whose top is in the heavens. But God came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. God was displeased and confused their languages so they could not communicate with one another. So in one night, everyone in Babel woke up and they were speaking different languages. They could no longer communicate with one another. The word Babel has come to mean confusion. God then scattered them over the face of the earth. And there you have the beginning of different languages and the beginning of 70 nations that came from the three sons of Noah. Genesis chapter 10 verse 5 says that from the three sons of Noah, the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. Understand, there are no Jews at this time. You don't have Jewish people until the time of Abraham. So everybody's a Gentile. Which, by the way, it becomes a word for heathen. We do not know what common language is spoken in the days of Nimrod. However, the oldest written language included Sumerian, used in Mesopotamia, which would include Shinar. So Mesopotamia would include modern-day Turkey, Iraq, and so forth, throughout that area. This language dates back about 5,000 years to the time of the flood. This language was also spoken in ancient Egypt. This does not mean that the Sumerian language was the earliest or the only language, as you will soon learn. We'll talk about that a little later. Now let's talk about the forming of different people groups into nations after Babel. We all understand that within the human race there are different skin colors and characteristics that set one people group apart from another. How do these different skin colors come about? Why are some born light-skinned and others dark-skinned? Dr. Henry Morris, in his book, The Biblical Basis for Modern Science, writes this. I'm quoting him now. It is reasonable to believe that God implanted in the first man and woman genetic information from which could be specified a wide variety of physiological characteristics among the descendants of Noah's family. Morris goes on to speak of dominant and recessive traits within the gene pool. When the population of the world is all together as it was at Babel, the dominant genes will prevail. Then I'm quoting him again. I've kind of summarized what he wrote just to be more brief. Anyway, when, however, men are forced to break into very small population groups, many of these recessive genes would have the opportunity to be expressed openly for the first time in distinct physical characteristics corresponding to each tribe. So I want us to understand this. It's like we go back to Adam. God implanted within the genes of Adam the ability, once the human race began to spread out, for various characteristics to take place. Skin color, facial looks, and so forth. So you have dominant genes and you have recessive genes. And what he's saying here in our text is, when everybody lived together at the Tower of Babel, he said 200,000 people, it was the dominant genes that predominated, not the recessive genes. So everybody spoke the same language and everybody looked alike. With me? Understand that? Now, after the Tower of Babel, people began to spread out into different areas. They have different locations, different environments. Now, because they have separated from the group over a period of time, the recessive genes now become more prominent over time. And so now you begin to get different skin colors. We're going to go into this more detailed. I'm just kind of summarizing because I don't want us to lose this thought that I'm sharing now. So it's when they spread out that the recessive genes now become more prominent, creating different color skin, creating different appearances, like the Asian people look different than the Caucasian, and the Negro people look different than the Caucasian, so forth. Okay, with me? Now, Ken Ham basically is saying the same thing in his book, Creation to Babel. He says how God initially put within the gene pool the characteristics necessary to create diversity. I'm quoting him. When people were scattered over the earth with new languages and geographic barriers, the groups no longer mixed freely within other groups, at least for a time. And the result was a splitting of the gene pool. Different cultures formed, with certain features becoming predominant within each group. The characteristics of each group became more and more prominent as new generations of children were born. If we travel back in time to the Tower of Babel and mix up people groups into completely different family groups, Ken Ham believes that the people groups then would completely have different characteristics. I mean, that would be possible, he says, to result. So it's the fact that the people are together, that the dominant genes dominate in every case. Everybody looks alike. But when you break up into groups, the recessive genes then become more prominent. So the conclusion is that within all family groups, dominant and recessive genes contain melanin, creating a darker pigmentation, but also for tanning the skin in the sunlight. Some family groups have more melanin than others, and hence the black family group comes into being. Other family groups could have formed within a few generations after the nations were divided by language differences. It seems clear that at Babel, different languages merged immediately as a miraculous act of God. Can't you imagine, you're going to bed one night and everybody can talk to one another, and then you wake up the next morning and you're speaking one language and the guy next to you is speaking another language, and it's all confusing. And so you look for people that speak the same language that you do, and that's who you begin to communicate with. So these languages then were unlearned and untaught. It was designed to cause confusion So Nimrod could not follow through with his plan of a one world government and a one world religion. In order for the people to communicate, they had to find those who spoke the same language and then scatter out together, eventually forming their own nation. As far as skin color and distinctive national characteristics, that happened over time, and it depended on the location where they eventually settled. Well, that was all verse 1, Genesis 10. Now let's look at verses 2 through 32, the direction of the sons of Noah in forming the nations. As we explore where the children of the three sons of Noah migrated after the Tower of Babel, we will learn this most specifically from the writings. Now, where do I get what I get? Well, I didn't read all their writings, but the people I read, this is the references they quote. People like Herodotus, who's considered the father of history. He died back in 431 BC, as well as the 8th century historian Hesiod, and from Jewish Roman historian Josephus. He died around 100 AD, and he had writings called the Antiquity of the Jews. So these historians, ancient historians, evidently had a copy of the Bible, had a copy of Genesis chapters 10 and 11. They saw all these names, and they began to follow them. Where did they go? What did they mean? So let's begin with the sons of Japheth and his family. The genealogies begin with the sons of Japheth, Noah's youngest son. So that's verses 2 through 5. His sons, now notice these names here for you who are prophecy buffs out here. His sons were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Thyras, sometimes spelled Tyrus. If you are familiar with Bible prophecy, there are some very significant names that formed nations listed in Ezekiel chapter 38. Now, what's significant about Ezekiel chapter 38? Remember, in the latter days, this is something that has not happened yet. We talk about this peace agreement in the Middle East. Listen, there may be temporary peace, but there's never going to be peace. In the latter days, according to Ezekiel 38, those nations, and we'll single out the names, will become a coalition and invade Israel in what is called the Gog-Magog War. Now, here are the names that come from Japheth's family that are going to participate, and then we'll try to identify the nations. They are Magog, Meshech, Rosh, and Gomer.
What are the current day names of those?
What?
The current day names of those countries.
I'm getting there. Let's first identify these nations that in the end times come against Israel. So here are the nations now of the future Gog-Magog war prophesied by Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. We begin with Gomer, Japheth's oldest son, became those whom the Greeks called the Galatians. And this would be an Eastern term. Remember, Paul wrote a letter to the churches of Galatia. So Galatia is a territory in Asia Minor, or was in Asia Minor as it was known then, but that would be modern-day Turkey, eastern part of Turkey today. They're known as Galatians. However, it is also known that they later spread out. So the people known as the Gomerites, you might say, they began to spread out across Europe from eastern Germany to an area by the Black Sea called Cimmeria or Crimea. Magog, now, Jacob's second son, according to Hesiod, settled in what would be southern Russia, and these people became known as the Scythians. When Ezekiel mentions Gog of the land of Magog, he's referring to the chief prince or the leader of Magog. So Magog is the grandson of Noah, the son of Japheth. Now notice that he settles in what would be southern Russia. And the people at that time were known as Scythians. We'll talk more about them. Now you have the name Tubal, Japheth's fourth son. According to the Hebrew scholar William Genesaris, was the founder of Tibernia, a people dwelling on the Black Sea west of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia today. Many Bible scholars also see Tubal as a reference to the central part of modern-day Turkey, which was also a territory occupied by the Scythians. So we notice that Russia and Turkey now are very much involved in the people of Japheth, here, Magog and Tubal. Historian Gesenisis speaks of Meshech as a barbarous people who settled in the region of the modern nations of Georgia and Armenia, Assyrian records refer to, get this now, Meshech as the Muski. The old name for Russia was Muscovy, a form of Mushki, from which the name Moscow originated. So Moscow, we have Russia, we have Turkey, very much involved in this war that's going to come against Israel. Follow me? Ezekiel also mentions Rosh, a Hebrew word translated chief. Rosh is found nearly 600 times in the Old Testament, but it is never used as a proper name with the possible exception of the Ezekiel text. Old Testament scholar Louis Bauman wrote this, I'm quoting him. The prince of Rosh is called Gog in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 2. It is also understood that Gog is the name given to the leader of this confederacy, and his land is called Magog, which comprises three parts, Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. These three names were associated with the Scythians. They roamed as nomads in the country around the north of the Black and Caspian Seas. Careful research has established the fact that Rosh is Russia. The prince of Rosh means, therefore, the prince or king of the Russian Empire. That's the quote from Louis Bauman. Then there is Togarmah, the third son of Gomer, and grandson of Japheth. So we're still in Japheth's line here. This clan is also part of the Gog-Magog coalition. His ancestry corresponds to southern Russia and the Cossacks and the Ukrainian people, but also to include eastern Turkey, with whom he is most associated. In addition to nations other than the family of Japheth that joined the Gog-Magog coalition, they are Persia, that would be modern-day Iran, Ethiopia and Libya, the latter two from northern Africa, and we will look at them a little later in this lecture. So, there's coming, here's what we're saying, there's coming a war against the nation of Israel. The leader of that war is going to be Russia. They're going to be joined by Turkey and by Iran and by Muslim nations that are part of northern Africa. In fact, all of the nations involved in this Gog-Magog war are Muslims, with the exception of Russia. But when you consider southern Russia today, all of southern Russia is Muslim. When you take the nations that were once a part of Russia, and they were known then in those days as the Scythians. It's interesting to note that when China built the Great Wall of China, the whole purpose of building the Great Wall of China was to keep out the Scythians, who were the Russians that were trying to invade into what we know today as modern-day China. We're going to talk about the Chinese. That's kind of an interesting, but I'm not there yet. Okay. I guess I just wanted you to understand why we were singling out these names and talking about them because they have prophecy in them that is yet fulfilled. And that's this Gog-Magog war. So, of the sons of Japheth, not mentioned not mentioned in Ezekiel's Gog-Magog war, okay, is Madai, whose family was called the Medes by the Greeks and who lived in Persia or modern-day Iran. Then I've got here in brackets, Iran is a nation involved in the Gog-Magog war. However, Iran is most identified with Elam, who was the oldest son of Shem. So a section of the Medo-Persian Empire, a section of modern-day Iran, was known as Elam, or the people were known as the Elamites. So they come from Japheth's family. The Madai clan was part of the Medo-Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Japheth's other sons were Javan, from whom came the Greeks, Pyrrhus, from whom came the Thracians, to include Bulgaria, northeastern Greece, and part of Turkey. So from the grandchildren of Japheth also came the Germans, the Spaniards, the Paphlonians, who occupied a section of northern Turkey, and the people of Cyprus. Did you notice that 4 of Japheth's family are part of modern-day Turkey? And here's what's significant. Modern-day Turkey is 99.8% Muslim. And one of the nations that Ezekiel prophesied will join Russia, Iran, and the Muslim nations from northern Africa in the future Gog-Magog war. What we also know about the family of Japheth is that he is called the father of the Indo-European nations. When Noah blessed Japheth, he asked God to enlarge Japheth. Remember, Noah had a blessing for 2 of his sons. Ham was not one of them. Japheth and Shem, he had a blessing for them. And his blessing was that God would enlarge Japheth. And enlarge he did. That is, Japheth's family did enlarge. No family spread out further than that of Japheth's. His descendants started in the west with Europe, crossed the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, and then to the east across the Pacific Ocean all the way to India and surrounding countries. So notice now the language of the sons of Japheth. What language did they speak? In the 19th century, it became clear that the different languages of the east and west were related. This is all now part of Japheth's family. Remember, he spread out from the east to the west, and there's a common language now from which the various languages have developed. So these were the territories of the sons of Japheth. This connection of languages required a common language ancestor. That language was discovered to be Sanskrit, the language that became the basis of both Eastern and Western languages. Now get this. Our English language has its origin in ancient Sanskrit. Today, linguistic students travel to India to study Sanskrit because it is the closest language to this entire range of languages. So what we have just learned is that the common source of the languages that stretch from Europe to India and the Far East is Sanskrit. Could it be that immediately after the Tower of Babel, the one language spoken by the family of Japheth was Sanskrit? I'm just raising a question. I don't know. But it's interesting to think about that. Okay, that's Japheth's family. We got 2 more families to go. We now pick up at verse 6 of Genesis 10, and we have the sons of Ham and his family. The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Now, we've already studied 2 important people in the family of Canaan, Ham rather. We've talked about Canaan, the 4th son of Ham, and the grandson of Noah, whom Noah cursed. His family formed the Canaanites, who occupied the promised land prior to the Israelites. Then Nimrod, that's the second one we've talked about. who was the son of Cush and the grandson of Ham, who was a mighty ruler and built the city of Babel. As I said, we're going to talk much more about that in January. As the Jebusites went east and west, they traveled everywhere. Some of Ham's sons went south to populate Africa. Cush, mentioned there, one of his sons, is Ethiopia. Mizraim is Egypt. Put is Libya, all located in North Africa. In Ethiopia, that would be Cush, and Libya, Put, you have two other specified nations that join with Magog in the future war against Israel. So, there are those who believe that from the family of Ham came the brown and black-skinned people. They reasoned that within the genes of Ham, there was sufficient melanin that over time the Negro people came to exist. The greater the melanin, the darker the skin. It is because families of Ham settled in Africa that the majority of blacks, that is why the majority of blacks live in Africa. Now, I threw this in, I talked a little bit about this in previous lessons, but I think it's interesting to bring it up. And the question is, were Negroes the first subhumans? I'm glad we don't have any in the class here, but we'll get this worked through.
Their features are different than ours.
What?
Their features are different than ours.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Atheistic evolutionists. I'm talking about atheists. I'm talking about evolution. I'm talking about right now what's taught in our universities, okay? Atheistic evolutionists believe that mankind evolved from the gibbon, the orangutan, or the chimpanzee, and thus the Negro race was first on the earth, but subhuman. The black man first came from one of those primates. So he evolved from a primate. The white man evolved from the black man, as over time, by means of good mutants in the genetic pool, less and less melanin was found in the black man until the white man evolved. So understand now, we white people, this is what's taught today, we white people came from the black people. The black people originated in Africa. Therefore, white people are superior and more intelligent than the Negro. That's why Charles Darwin wrote in his book, The Descent of Man, called the Caucasians, we're the white people, here I'm quoting him, more civilized. And in the future, I'm quoting him, the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. I read his book, The Descent of Man, and scary. A disciple of Darwin by the name of Henry Fairfield Osborn wrote this: the standard of intelligence of a Negro is similar to that of an 11-year-old of the Homo sapiens. Atheist philosopher Thomas Huxley wrote, no rational man, cognizant of the facts, believes that the average Negro is equal, still less the superior of the white man. Evolutionists also have taught that the Australian Aborigines were the missing link between the Negro and the white man. There was a time when the Aborigines were hunted by the white man. 33,000 skulls of Aborigines were stored in the basement of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. They were to be displayed as an example of evolution from ape to man. I was going to bring a necktie. I don't know why I didn't. I've been to Australia. If you ever go to Australia, go to the city of Cairns, located in the northeastern part of Australia. And there you'll meet the Aborigines. And they're extremely, very small people. And they have unique art. And so I have some art in our house done by the Aborigines, and I have a necktie. And all their art is done in dots. So it's a very, very interesting. Anyway, we'll get on with this. In the year 1904, World's Fair in Chicago, a Negro named Ota Benga was put in a cage with a chimpanzee to demonstrate evolution. Oda went insane and committed suicide. Evolution is the most racist subject of anything taught in our educational system today. Now notice anthropology and the study of different people groups. Now, I'm going back a long time, but I remember some of this and then I confirmed it. When I was a student at Long Beach State, that would be 60 years ago almost. Goodness. I took a course in anthropology. I remember to this day what the professor taught about the various races, and it's still being supported by my research. So I went to AI, ChatGPT. What I'm going to read now comes from AI, ChatGPT. It's basically what I remember from my anthropology class. Anthropologists trace the beginning of the human race to Africa, where humans evolved 300,000 years ago. Given the high ultraviolet radiation levels in equatorial Africa, it is widely held that these early humans had dark skin pigmentation. Dark skin, rich in melanin, offers protection against the harmful effects of UV radiation, such as DNA damage and folate. I didn't know what folate was, so I looked it up. It's vitamin B, which produces red blood cells. So you have DNA and folate degradation, which are crucial for reproductive success and overall health. So you have to have that melanin in there or there's problems. As the human population migrated out of Africa and settled in regions with varying UV radiation levels, natural selection favored natural selection favored a range of skin pigmentation. In areas with low UV radiation, lighter skin evolved to facilitate adequate vitamin D synthesis, essential for bone health and immune function. This variation in skin color among human populations is the result of adaptation to diverse conditions over tens of thousands of years. So basically what they're saying is 300,000 years ago came the black people and they moved out, with less melanin in them, and that's where the white people came from. This teaching still confirms that the black man was first on earth, and through migration from Africa, the white man evolved. Now, this is different than what the Bible says. The Bible says that the first people on earth came from Mesopotamia in the Middle East about 6,000 years ago. They were all of one color and spoke one language. It was God's judgment on Nimrod and the people of Babel that separated these people into different nations and languages. Well, we've talked about the family of Japheth and Ham. Well, we're still going to talk about the family of Ham. We're going to talk about the extended family of Ham here. It was from the family of Ham that many of the early tribes of Israel settled in the Promised Land. So from the family of Ham come the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Sunites, the Philistines, along with the Canaanites and all the otherites. One interesting family to come from Ham was the Hittites, who had an empire in the area of northern Turkey. At the time of Abraham, they were in the land of Canaan. This is Genesis 15:20. We're talking about the Hittites. I did this a few weeks ago in a lesson, talked about archaeological finds of the Hittites, but I'm doing it for a different purpose here, so follow me. There's an interesting archaeological note about the Hittites. 47 times the Bible mentions them. Their existence was doubted, as no record of their existence existed outside the Bible. But in the year 1876, a British scholar by the name of A.H. Sayce deciphered a script discovered in rocks in Turkey and Syria mentioning the Hittites. Subsequent digs by a German cuneiform expert, Hugo Winkler, unearthed 5 Hittite temples, a fortified citadel, and more than 10,000 clay tablets. They all announced to the world that the Hittite people really existed, just as the Bible said. Now, here's our question, and here's the reason why I brought up the Hittites specifically. Did the Chinese originate from the Hittites as a descendant from Ham? That's our question. It is believed that the descendants of Ham have a connection with the Hittites through a tribe called the Sinite. That's mentioned in Genesis chapter 10, verse 17. The Sinite people, descendants of Ham. This relative of Canaan had the actual name of Sinim, and this word appears in Isaiah chapter 49, verse 12. Now I'm quoting now Chuck Missler. Many of you remember him, long gone, but headed up what's known as Koinonia House. I'm quoting now from Chuck Missler. The label Sinim derives from Chinen, the feudal state of China from 897 to 221 BC. It was Chinen that unified China in the 3rd century BC and built the Great Wall. In later eras, the Chinen boundaries were always considered to embrace the indivisible area of China proper. Indivisible area of China proper. It is from the dynasty that the name China is derived. Thus we have sinology, the study of Chinese people, especially with reference to their language, literature, history, and culture. Then you have Heinrich Genesis, who died in 1842. He wrote the Hebrew Chaldean lexicon. It speaks of the tribe called the Sinite, mentioned in Isaiah 49, verse 12, same verse we just talked about. I'm quoting him now from his lexicon. The context requires that this must be a very remote country, remote from Judah. I understand it to be the Cirrus. Now, I didn't know what Cirrus, so I didn't put this in your notes, but you might want to make a note of it. It's people of similar relations. People who very similar to one another. I understand that to be the Cirrus of Chinese, Sinonese. This very ancient and celebrated nation was known by the Arabians and Syrians and might be known by a Hebrew living in Babylon. At what point this name was given to the Chinese by the other nations of Asia and what its origin may be do not plainly appear. But he's associating this word Sinite with the Chinese people. Now, we can go further. Dr. Henry Morris, I quoted him earlier. It is significant that the Chinese people have always been identified with the prefix Sino, as in sinology, which is a study of Chinese history. Morris goes on to identify the name Sinon in Isaiah chapter 49, verse 12 as the Chinese people who originated from the family of Ham and the tribe of Sinai. A Strong's exhaustive concordance states the plural of Sinim is a distant oriental region, a distant oriental region. Some other historians and scholars who identify Sinim as China are the Hebrew scholar Ben Israel, died in 1657. German scholars C.F. Kyle and Franz Delitzsch, whose Old Testament commentaries are among the most respected by Bible scholars. I had a whole series of their commentaries. There seems little doubt that the Chinese people originated from the family of Ham and were a distinct relative of the Hittites, from whom came the Sinites, or the Chinese people. Now, there we go. Now, one more here. Let's look at the sons of Shem and his family. This takes us starting at verse 21 of chapter 10, and then verse 10 to the end of the chapter 11. So the sons of Shem were Eber, Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Amram. While Shem is the oldest son of Noah, he's listed last in the genealogy because his bloodline leads to Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. It is Abraham and his family that comprise the rest of the book of Genesis. We spoke earlier about Eber, Shem's first son. Verse 21 says that Shem was the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder. It is from Shem that we get the word Semite, a name used to identify the Jews. And from Shem came all the sons of Eber, who gave us the name Hebrew to the chosen people. We talked about that. But what I want to emphasize here is we hear a lot of talk about anti-Semitism. The word Semite comes from the word Shem, one of the three sons of Noah. And from Eber comes the word Hebrew. Now, most of the families of Shem settled in the Middle East. Elon, son of Shem, mentioned in verse 22, is the father of the Elamites. The Elamites lived east of Mesopotamia. It would be Iraq and Turkey, whose capital city was Susa, and whose people mixed with the Medes to form the Persian Empire. It is the Persians, modern-day Iran, that will join the Magog, will join with Magog in the war against Israel. I said Iraq, but it includes Iran. The Elamites were Iranian people. Shem's second son was Ashur, the father of the Assyrians, who later in history became a world empire that conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. Then his third son, Arphaxad, was in the bloodline of Abraham, but whose nation of people is unknown. His fourth son, Lud, became the father of the Lydians in Asia Minor, a small portion of present-day Turkey. His fifth son, Amram, became the father of Syria. It was the Armenians or Syrians who developed the Aramaic language, portions of which are found in ancient manuscripts of the Old Testament in books of Daniel and Ezra. A point of interest, but not specifically mentioned in our text, is that the Arab nations came from Ishmael and Esau. They were a son and a grandson of Abraham, who, as already stated, came from the line of Shem, remember, through Joktan. And remember, when you get to the 11th chapter of Genesis, Joktan is not mentioned, but is mentioned in the genealogy of Shem in chapter 10, because Joktan then becomes the Arab people. From Isaac, the son of promise through Sarah, wife of Abraham, came the Israelites, and these two people groups, the Arabs and the Jews, can both be traced back to Abraham. Historically, they have been bitter enemies to this very day, as seen in the Arab-Israeli conflicts and wars. In verse 23 of our text, this is chapter 11, take note that the oldest son of Amram was named Uz. This city is important in that it was the hometown of Job. In bringing summation, so we're going to summarize this now, to this genealogical record in Genesis chapter 10, the family of Japheth settled across Europe all the way to India. They became the Gentiles. His family had the widest geographical spread. If you are of European descent, as I am, you can trace your genealogy all the way back to Japheth. The family of Ham settled in the Middle East and in Africa. If your family originated in those areas, you can trace your genealogy back to Ham. The family of Shem settled in the Middle East, fathering both the Arabs and the Israelites through a branch of his family, the Sinaites, who went to Asia and formed a people known as the Chinese. If your family is Jewish, Arab, Asian, or Indian, of Indian descent, you can trace your genealogy back to Shem. Wow, okay. Now let me just summarize this whole thing up. What are lessons to be learned? God has set boundaries for the nations, something our government needs to understand. Acts 17:26. And created different languages because he does not want a one-world government and a one-world apostate religion. There are not multiple races. That's another thing I want us to learn. But one race, the human race. We all have the same common mother in Eve. We are all of one blood. We need to do away with using the term race when discussing the different people groups of the world. The idea of race is rooted in the early evolutionists, even before Charles Darwin. It was designed to distinguish one race as superior to another, and this thinking has resulted in racism that is now worldwide, especially anti-Semitism. And of course, there's a lot of racism, you might say, against the black people. We need to understand that every human being is our relative, regardless of how distant that relationship may be. Finally, amen. Let's remember that every human being, regardless of the color of their skin, is of equal value before our Creator God. Any descendant of Adam can be saved because our mutual relative by blood, Jesus Christ, died and rose again. That is why we are commanded to make disciples by preaching the gospel around the world. And there, the headache should end.